On the night of April 13th, 2024, Iranian and proxy forces throughout the Middle East launched a massive aerial attack that would see hundreds of drones and missiles pour into the night sky with their sights set on targets inside Israel. This barrage of munitions saturated the sky from seemingly every angle, with slow-moving loitering munitions traversing the hundreds of miles to their targets at low altitudes, ballistic missiles screaming through the sky at hypersonic speeds tens of thousands of feet above them, and air-breathing cruise missiles soaring in between. At an undisclosed airbase in the region, F-15E Strike Eagles scrambled under a symphony of Patriot interceptors impacting drones and cruise missiles overhead. Air Force personnel were instructed to seek shelter in nearby bunkers, but many chose to remain on the flight line, pumping fuel and loading ordnance onto aircraft to get them back into the fight. Further south, F-16s were the first to engage the flood, and after just minutes, they called out over the radio that they were out of missiles. Heck, they were out of bullets. That's how many targets there were. As the drones and missiles came into range, the Strike Eagles opened fire, launching missile after missile at targets they could barely see, and when their missiles ran dry, some fighters switched to guns, diving below safe operating altitudes to chase their targets through the inky darkness. And when the fighting finally subsided, just 6 out of some 300 weapons launched actually made landfall in Israel. The rest were wiped out by fighters and air defenders in what's being described as the largest air-to-air engagement in better than a half century. But in the heat of the moment, success was anything but assured. So let's talk about what happened that night in April and what it says about the future of air-to-air combat. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. It's now been confirmed that Ukraine has launched American-sourced ballistic missiles at targets inside of Russia, in a significant development in this ongoing conflict. And like any story that's so susceptible to Russian disinformation, you better believe I've been using ground news to stay on top of it. Ground News is an aggregator that collects news stories published by outlets all around the world and combines them all into a single easy-to-read feed, making it easier than ever to not only stay on top of things, but to see right through the forms of bias that are so common in media coverage today. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 521 news outlets have already covered this story, and at least so far, left-leaning outlets have been a bit more reserved in their headlining, running pretty straightforward headlines like Ukraine fires first US-made long-range missiles into Russia, whereas right-leaning outlets have used more sensational headlines with phrases like Ukraine drops the trigger, World War III alert, or Putin may respond with nuclear strike. But of course, as I record this is still a somewhat breaking story, and these trends are likely to change, and I can use Ground News to stay on top of them while they do. Not only does Ground News make it easy to compare headlines all throughout the media sphere, but it also gives you pertinent information about each outlet, things like their political bias, who owns them, and whether or not they're government affiliated. And I love their blind spot feature that shows me stories that are getting lots of coverage in one political sphere and not in the other. It's a great way to help make sure my media consumption stays balanced. I use Ground News every day, and from now until the end of the year, I can get you 50% off the same Vantage plan that I use. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or follow the link in the description below to get 50% off their Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's to get 50% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. Last week, 30 service members were recognized for their commitment to duty and courage under fire during the Iranian attack of April 13th, 2024, including Captain Lacie Sonic Hester, an F-15E Strike Eagle weapons systems officer, and her pilot, Major Benjamin Irish Coffey, both of whom received the nation's 3rd highest award for valor, the Silver Star. For Sonic, the award also comes with a historic footnote, as she's the first female airman ever to earn this distinction and only the third woman force-wide to be awarded a Silver Star since the end of World War II. Major Clayton Wicks and Master Sergeant Timothy Adams were each awarded Bronze Stars. No fewer than 14 other airmen received Distinguished Flying Crosses, 6 with V devices for valor and 4 more to indicate action in combat. 6 received Air and Space Commendation Medals, and 6 more received Air and Space Achievement Medals. It was a momentous occasion that reflected not just the bravery and professionalism demonstrated throughout their defensive stand in April, but in some cases, even their record-setting performance, turning aircraft around and getting them back into the fight at an unprecedented pace. But just over 7 months earlier, at an undisclosed airbase in the Middle East, moods were decidedly less celebratory. The men and women of the UK-based 494th Fighter Squadron, known as the Panthers, had been deployed to the region since the preceding October, heading to the Middle East shortly after the October 7th Hamas-led terror attack on Israel kicked off the ongoing and extremely controversial conflict in Gaza. In the intervening months, Panthers had taken down a handful of drones as they made their way toward Israel, but for the most part, things were fairly quiet. But as Israel and Iran continued to trade tit-for-tat attacks, Major Benjamin Irish Coffey recognized that it was only a matter of time before he and his wingmen would be facing a much bigger challenge. You see, of the 3 types of weapons Iran would likely use in a large-scale attack on Israel, 2 were within the Strike Eagle's means to bring down, and it was increasingly looking like it was not a question of if Iran would launch such an attack, but rather when. Coffey knew the attack would come in the form of ballistic missiles like Iran's Sejil missile, air-breathing cruise missiles like their Somar, and one-way drones like the infamous Shahed 136 that's seen significant use in Ukraine under the Russian designation Garin 2. Ballistic missiles can be thought of as weaponized rockets, carried aloft by conventional rocket propulsion before separating from their boosters at extremely high altitudes and careening back toward their targets at immense speeds, sometimes in excess of Mach 20. In fact, despite common perceptions of hypersonic missiles being the fastest in service, ballistic missiles often travel at higher speeds and reach their targets sooner. But none of this would be Coffey's concern. Air defense platforms like America's MIM-104 Patriot, which has seen success downing Russia's faux hypersonic Kinzhal missile in Ukraine, as well as Israel's Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems, are particularly well suited for ballistic missile defense, and it would be up to them to keep these high-flying threats from making landfall. That left cruise missiles and suicide drones to focus on. Unlike ballistic missiles, cruise missiles are usually powered by air-breathing jet engines, often turbojets similar to those you might find on dated fighters. Now, this allows cruise missiles to fly a lot like fighters do, along fairly horizontal flight paths, while using things like the curvature of the Earth and even the terrain to mask their approach. American fighter pilots often train to bring down these sorts of threats, but this is another area where air defense systems tend to perform pretty well. Cruise missiles also tend to be pretty expensive, meaning Iran was less likely to employ them in really significant numbers. But that left one-way drones and loitering munitions like the aforementioned Shahed 136, and that posed a real problem. While the Strike Eagle carries a modern and advanced AN/APG-82 V1 active electronically scanned array radar, loitering munitions like the Shahed 136 represent a pretty unique challenge. Not only are drones very small targets, but their low-flying altitude makes it easier for them to blend in with ground clutter. Their small radar cross-section and low speeds are also an issue, as the fighter's targeting software was designed for engaging larger airborne threats like enemy aircraft, and may mistake something flying so low and slow for nothing more than a bird. I'll quote Coffey now. You're talking about something that's on the very edge of a fighter aircraft's ability to detect, what we call find, fix, track, target, and engage. The best radar in the inventory is in this airplane behind us, and no one really knew whether or not its capability to find these drones even existed. So Coffey took the initiative, reviewing footage from the few drone engagements the 494th had already conducted, and combining it with every other resource he could find into a paper he drafted for the unit on the most effective methods of locating, targeting, and engaging drone threats. As the days wore on, the paper made its rounds to air crews throughout the unit, but there was little opportunity to actually practice the tactics as the airmen waited on high alert for Iran's attack. And then on April 1st, Israel struck targets in Syria that housed senior members of Iran's elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, and word of Iran's pending reprisal spread throughout the region like wildfire. Recognizing that the attack would almost certainly come at night, the squadron soon put plans into place to keep 2 Strike Eagles in the air at all times throughout the night, flying in 6-hour shifts, with additional crews ready to launch more fighters within 30 minutes if and when the attack commenced. This time, I'll quote Major Clayton Rifle Wicks. We were on kind of an alert status for about a week and a half leading up to that point. We knew there was going to be some sort of large-scale attack. How big, we didn't quite know. And when exactly, we didn't quite know. On the night of April 13th, Coffey and Hester prepared for their 6-hour shift alongside Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Curtis Culver and Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Causey in the 2nd Strike Eagle. As the air crews later recounted, they walked into their nightly briefing expecting more of the same waiting game that they'd grown accustomed to. But that night, things were very different. Major Clayton Rifle Wicks had flown his shift the night prior, so that night he was serving in the role of operations supervisor, effectively relaying information between the Combined Air Operations Center, other command and control elements, and the crews in the aircraft. He was the first to receive the intelligence report that Iran was mobilizing its missile forces, and the attack was imminent. As he recalled, he relayed all the information he could to the pilots as they headed straight for their waiting aircraft on the flight line, but there were still lots of question marks dominating the airspace above them. I'll quote Wicks now. Things were just happening so fast out there that it was pretty much a sort of a pickup game. I remember feeling guilty that I couldn't do more for them before launching my friends out into the darkness to who knows what. So that part was tough. The Strike Eagles roared into the sky, carrying 8 air-to-air missiles each, though the Defense Department has not disclosed exactly how many of which types of missiles were slung under wing. At least one pilot testimony mentions firing a Fox 3, which denotes the use of an active radar-guided missile, which could only be a variant of America's AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, or AMRAAM. But it's likely these jets carried a mix of AMRAAMs and shorter-range infrared-guided AIM-9 Sidewinders. Wicks monitored the command and control feed as his wingmen were joined in the air around the region by newly arrived Strike Eagles from the 335th Fighter Squadron out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. Further south, F-16s out of the D.C. National Guard's 113th Wing were also flying, and they were the first to engage the incoming drones and missiles. Within minutes, Wicks received an update on the nature of the threat headed their way. I'll quote him now. A message comes across that just says, like, Viper 72 is Winchester, which means they are out of missiles. They have no bullets left. They have nothing. And I remember I got chills, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because that was the first time I was like, oh my gosh, command and control can't keep up with the amount of missiles that are being shot and the things that are happening. And that's the only message they got across. As the base sprang into action over the impending attack, Airman First Class Isaac Schumann, an F-15 engine mechanic on the ground, recalled the exact moment the fight arrived over their remote airbase. I'll quote him now. One of the weapons guys kind of pointed off into the distance, and so we all turned and looked, and you could see the Patriot systems, all the stuff that's supposed to be defending our base, going off and blowing up drones and stuff in the sky. In the air, a few thousand feet above them, Coffey and Hester were playing the role of mission commanders, coordinating with other aircraft to divide the airspace up into lanes and ensure they were all covered. Just as Coffey had predicted, they were staring straight into the face of an approaching drone swarm, and these drones were anything but 20-pound quadcopters. Iran's Shahed 136 is among a new class of weapon that blurs the line between cruise missile and drone. Often referred to as a loitering munition or a kamikaze drone, these platforms stretch about 11 feet from front to back, roughly 3.5 meters, with an 8.2-foot wingspan, around 2.5 meters. At around 440 pounds, these sizable weapons can carry a 110-pound high-explosive warhead to targets as far as 1,600 miles away at speeds of around 115 miles per hour. And as the aircrews watched from their cockpits, their radar appeared to be filling up with them. But recognizing the difficulty their radar may have in identifying these low and slow drones, Hester switched over to the Strike Eagle's targeting pod to confirm their targets really were targets and weren't just cars or something else showing up on their radar screens. As Hester relayed her visual confirmation, Coffey came to realize just how serious the situation had become. I'll quote him now. "I first get hit with dread, recognizing the numbers we were seeing. This wasn't a small-scale or chest-thumping show of force. This was an attack designed to cause significant damage, to kill, to destroy, and now we are literally on the leading edge of firepower, able to do something about that. And that lasted maybe for 10, 15 seconds, and then training kicked in, and it was just time to get the job done." Captain Austin Apex Leak was flying alongside his wingman as the drones broached the horizon. He recalls when Coffey called out over the radio, "Drone Air, Fox 3, indicating that he'd fired his first AMRAAM at an approaching drone. With that, the fight was on. Coffey and Hester prioritized the attack drones, knowing the multiple layers of air defense systems behind them would have the best chance at knocking down the much smaller number of cruise missiles in the air. The air crews set about coordinating their targets with one another and engaging with air-to-air missiles, making multiple passes to bring the drones down. This time, I'll quote Captain Matthew Pepper Eddins. "As we were turning away just so we could build some more space from the next wave, you look back and you see drones impacting the ground, like, oh, they got another one, they got another one. Looking a few miles away and you see another one impacts, oh, the Viper's got another one. And then you hear from your flight lead, hey, turn hot, so pitch your aircraft back around and target again. Here we go again, and it's almost just repetitive at that point. In less than 20 minutes, nearly every weapon on every fighter had been expended, with the notable exception of one missile on Coffey and Hester's aircraft that had failed to fire, creating yet another potential emergency to contend with, commonly known in aviation circles as hung ordnance. And it would only get worse from there. I'll quote Coffey again. This missile, we don't know if it's armed. We don't know if it's going to explode on our wing. We don't know if it's going to explode while maintenance is safing the aircraft. It's a big deal. And now, as we start the landing process, we enter alarm red. Now, alarm red effectively means the base was locking down in preparation for the attack. This time, I'll quote Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Causey. Missiles and drones are flying over base and they're being intercepted over base, so the alarm red goes off. Then at that point is really when you see a lot of military discipline and a lot of bravery under fire. Now this meant that Coffey now needed to not only land his aircraft with a malfunctioning live missile under wing, he had to do it while flying through a hailstorm of intercepts taking place over the base. Other Strike Eagles radioed in about explosions in the airspace above the airbase, and they were instructed to just stay airborne as long as they could, and not to divert to backup airbases, as they were probably facing a similar situation. As part of the alarm red protocol, airmen were instructed to seek shelter in bunkers, meant to protect them from the falling debris, but many opted to ignore the order. I'll quote Culver again. There was an airman at one point standing next to a fuel truck with tons and tons of fuel in it, just pumping gas into the jet with stuff exploding over the base. I mean, the courage of that airman, that American, to stand up and do that for an ally is incredible. Coffey and Hester managed to make it to the ground, and they quickly climbed out of their cockpit. The pair had downed 6 targets with 7 missiles before being forced to land, and now, with weapon crews working to safely remove their malfunctioning missile, they could do nothing but run to a bunker themselves. But just a few minutes after arriving in the safety of the bunker, the duo learned that there was another Strike Eagle on the flight line that was ready to fly. So they dusted themselves off and got right back into the fight. Once airborne, Coffey and Hester headed right for the thick of it, quickly burning through all 8 of their air-to-air missiles and then deciding to go in for guns. This is among the most dangerous things a fast-moving fighter like the Strike Eagle could do against high-explosive targets like drones. The F-15E would struggle to fly slow enough to not just zoom past the drone targets, meaning they would have very little chance to score a hit with their M61 Vulcan 20mm autocannon. And if they did score a hit, there was a good chance their jet would absorb the fireball and the shrapnel as it closed the remaining distance. And to make matters worse, they'd have to fly at extremely low altitudes to pull it off, eliminating any margin for error and dramatically increasing the chances of straight up colliding with the Earth if Coffey's concentration faltered for even an instant. But perhaps fortunately then for Coffey and Hester, their first attempt at gun-running the drones failed. I'll quote Coffey again. You feel the terrain rush. You feel yourself getting closer and closer to the ground. The risk was just too high to try again. While Coffey and Hester weren't successful at downing drones with their 20mm cannon, the fact that they turned to the cannon at all says a lot about the severity of this situation. With hundreds of targets careening through the sky and only so many missiles to bring them down, things were getting desperate. Back on the ground, mechanics and weapon loaders were braving the hail of falling debris to rapidly rearm and refuel the fighters to get them turned around and back into the fight. In order to do so, they turned to a procedure commonly called ICTs, or Integrated Combat Turns. Now that's just military lingo for rapidly rearming and refueling an aircraft to get it right back into the sky, and this practice had fallen out of favor to some extent within the Air Force during the relative peace of post-Cold War operations, but it's seen a significant resurgence in recent years, and despite the chaos surrounding them, Airman First Class Schumann and the rest of the ground crews from the 494th managed to complete an integrated combat turn in record time, getting one of those Strike Eagles refueled, rearmed, and back in the air in just 32 minutes. All told, the 66 airmen of the 494th launched 6 alert aircraft and a total of 14 combat sorties, all while air defense assets engaged missiles and drones flying right above their heads. As night turned to day on April 14th, the Strike Eagles of the 494th were responsible for a large portion of the 70 loitering munitions left smoldering on the desert floor. All told, the coalition of American, British, French, Jordanian, and Israeli forces brought down an incredible 99% of all inbound weapons, with only 6 of some 300 in total making landfall inside Israel. Master Sergeant Timothy Adams was among the troops awarded for his actions that night, receiving a Bronze Star for his heroism, but he's most proud of how the airmen in the unit handled themselves that night. I'll quote him now. It still gives me chills when I think about how well the team worked together. I wasn't the linchpin of that. I was just a guy holding the radio, the node between ops and maintenance. The team is who made it happen. The aircraft maintenance driver, the weapons teams, the fuels, all those people working together, not running, not dropping the hoses, not just freaking out and worried about their own lives. How could you not be proud of that? And you know, whenever possible, I try to close with something poignant, but I don't think I could do any better than that. So with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.